Hello, and welcome to my lightning talk. Do traditional knowledge labels have the potential to ease intellectual property concerns around using traditional knowledge in OER localizing, remixing, and publishing? I'm Lauren Bradage, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a paper written for Indigenous LIS in a Canadian context at the University of Alberta in the spring 2020 semester. I acknowledge that I come to this work as a queer, white, cisgendered female of settler colonial descent living and working on the Haldeman Tract, the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. By profession, I am a copyright specialist at Wilfrid Laurier University, where I serve the needs of students and faculty in making course readings available affordably and accessibly and ensuring that faculty members are complying with copyright and licensing terms in their course readings and instruction. I also have an educational background in both pedagogy and the cultural study of religions, including the traditions of Canada's Indigenous peoples. This paper combined my educational background and my professional experience to explore whether or not Indigenous traditional knowledge, TK, can be included in open educational resources, OERs. And if so, how do we make that happen? To that end, this presentation outlines the discoveries that I made along the way. It also highlights the things that I learned and the importance of conducting more work and research in this area. My goal today is that you will come away from this presentation with an understanding of why it is important to get Indigenous TK into OERs and how we can work towards making that happen via traditional knowledge labels. So, what is traditional knowledge? TK isn't just Indigenous content related to histories and sociocultural experiences. You'll commonly hear the phrase Indigenous ways of knowing in relation to TK because it is knowledge that shapes how Indigenous peoples see the world around them and how they teach information to others. TK doesn't come from the same sources used in Western settler colonial viewpoints. It can come from the land, stories, and personal knowledge, for example. Why is this relevant to OERs? Well, one of the aims of both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is to see Indigenous knowledge, culture, traditions, and histories integrated into Canadian classrooms at all levels. And Indigenous knowledge includes TK. And TK includes traditional cultural expressions. So what are those? TK is an umbrella term, and traditional cultural expressions, TCEs, are elements covered by that umbrella. If you think about Indigenous ways of knowing as being another way of saying TK, then think about its counterpart, Indigenous ways of being, as being aligned with TCEs. WIPO uses the term traditional cultural expression to refer to both the tangible and intangible forms in which TK and cultures are expressed, communicated, or manifested. Now, let's move on to copyright. Copyright has and continues to be a tool of colonial dispossession. Indigenous communities don't own their entire cultural heritage, which is one of their main concerns when it comes to their TK. It's been very difficult for Indigenous communities to both physically and digitally repatriate their TK and TCEs, such as recordings of songs and dances done by scholars, photographs taken to document their cultural practices. Sadly, even when they can regain physical possession of those TCEs, they still might not be able to control the use because intellectual property rights prevent them from being seen as the rights holders. This leads to the second concern. It's not that they don't want to share. Based on conversations I've had, presentations I've watched, and articles I've read, Indigenous communities do want to share their TK. Not only to educate their own young people, but to educate non-Indigenous people as well in hopes of furthering reconciliation efforts. Their main concern is retaining control of the information and how it's used and shared. Protecting TCEs and TK is a sensitive topic because TK not only comprises a substantial element of their right to cultural self-determination, but also their economic and social development. So any appropriation, misrepresentation, or trivializing of their TK deprives them not only of their dignity, but also of any of the financial benefits. All Indigenous communities do agree, however, that any TK that is considered sacred or secret must not be made openly accessible at any point. And it's my understanding that many Indigenous communities would be open to the open use of their TK, provided we can find some way to license and protect the use and distribution of the TK. That's where I see the 18 TK labels coming into play. A TK label is not a copyright license. Unlike a Creative Commons license or other open license, they're not legally enforceable on their own. The development of Local Contexts, the organization that manages the labels, centered around providing a space to support communities that were thinking about how to use copyright, what that means, where it's useful and where it isn't. The TK labels act as a digital cultural protocol for sharing knowledge. They're an effort to translate the traditional written protocols into protocols that can sit within a digital infrastructure. So the goal of the labels is to return control of Indigenous knowledge to Indigenous communities. Jane Anderson, the co-director of Local Contexts, has explained on multiple occasions that these labels are specifically designed to be usable with Creative Commons licenses. And in an ongoing conversation she and I have been having as I developed this presentation, she's been telling me about the current effort by faculty members to work with communities to use the labels and Creative Commons licenses to develop college and university curriculums that include TK. So that brings us to the importance of relationality. This is the concept that we are all related to each other, to the natural environment, and to the spiritual world. And these relationships bring about interdependencies. It's a core way of understanding the world for Indigenous peoples, and therefore relationships really matter to them. That's one of the foundational ideas of the TK labels, because the labels are designed to only be applied by Indigenous communities. Any researcher or faculty member wanting to use a community's TK needs to form a relationship with that community in order to build and apply the applicable labels. So this connection was amplified for me by Carrie Billy, the president of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, also known as AHAC. During a keynote event for the Open Textbook Network Summit over the summer, she spoke about why AHAC has embraced the use of OERs in their schools. It's because their students are some of the most underprivileged, underserved, and marginalized student groups. They're adversely affected by both the high cost of textbooks and a lack of representation of their culture, language, and sovereignty within traditional higher education. So now that we have all the pieces, what's next? When I put these pieces together, the picture they paint is clear. I can see a future where researchers and faculty members work with Indigenous communities to localize, remix, and publish OERs that include TK labeled with TK labels to explain the appropriate use of the material. During this exploration, I didn't find any OERs using TK labels, but there are several that do contain unlabeled TK. And in preparing this talk, I was sent a report titled Community First, Open Practices and Indigenous Knowledge by the 2020 eCampus Ontario Open Education Fellow, Krista McCracken, and co-authored by Skyly Storm Hogan. This contained a survey of all of the OERs they could find that contain TK. I found a couple that their report didn't contain, the Indigenous Fisheries Training Framework videos and student workbook created by a relationship between faculty at the University of Alberta and the Witchin Tribal Council that accompanied a series of digital literacy workshops. That last example even included a statement acknowledging the rights of the Indigenous community. I was thrilled to find McCracken and Hogan's report because it reached very similar conclusions to my paper. It even validated the notion that in order to use TK labels with Creative Commons licenses, you're probably going to have to use a no derivatives clause, which does go against our Western-centric idea of the 5 R's of open, but it's a notion that McCracken and Hogan agree with, and they have it backed up by Indigenous elders. There is value in the idea of pairing TK labels with Creative Commons licenses through relationships with Indigenous communities to get TK in the OERs. It won't be easy and it will take work, but I think it's work we should be doing, and I plan to continue exploring this path. So that brings us to the end of my slide presentation, and I really hope you enjoyed hearing this lightning talk. Thanks.